The story of Gabriel Fernandez is one of unimaginable tragedy and systemic failure. At just 8 years old, Gabriel endured horrific abuse that ultimately led to his death. This case revealed deep flaws in child protective services and highlighted the urgent need for reform. Gabriel's story continues to inspire efforts to protect vulnerable children and ensure no other child suffers a similar fate.
Gabriel Fernandez was born on February 20, 2005, in Palmdale, California. From the moment of his birth, his life was marked by instability. Raised by relatives for most of his early years, Gabriel was briefly placed under the care of his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isoro Aguirre. In 2012, Pearl Fernandez had a troubled past. Known for her history of drug abuse and criminal activity, she struggled with parenting responsibilities. Isoro Aguirre, her boyfriend, initially appeared kind and attentive, but was later revealed to be deeply abusive and controlling. Gabriel's life took a dark turn after moving in with Pearl and Isoro. Despite being just 8 years old, Gabriel endured unimaginable physical and emotional abuse. Teachers and classmates noticed signs of neglect and injuries, but their concerns were often overlooked or dismissed by authorities. Neighbors and relatives raised alarms about Gabriel's welfare, yet the system repeatedly failed him. Social workers visited the home, but did not take sufficient action, leaving Gabriel in an increasingly dangerous environment. The abuse Gabriel suffered was relentless. He was beaten, starved, and forced to eat cat litter. He was also locked in a small cabinet for hours and subjected to verbal and psychological torment. The perpetrators sought to dehumanize and control him in every way possible. Despite the horrific conditions, Gabriel's teachers reported his injuries and emotional distress to social services multiple times. However, these warnings were not acted upon effectively, highlighting systemic failures within child protective services. On May 22, 2013, Gabriel was found unconscious in his home. He had suffered severe head trauma and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors described his injuries as some of the worst they had ever seen. He passed away 2 days later, on May 24, 2013. The case shocked the nation. Gabriel's death became a symbol of the failures of child protective services and the devastating consequences of unchecked abuse. His story prompted widespread outrage and demands for systemic reform. Following Gabriel's death, Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre were arrested and charged with his murder. The details that emerged during the trial painted a horrifying picture of their cruelty and neglect. Prosecutors described Isoro Aguirre as a sadistic individual who took pleasure in inflicting pain on Gabriel. Pearl Fernandez, while less physically involved, was complicit in the abuse and did nothing to protect her son. The courtroom was filled with heartbreaking evidence, including graphic photos and testimony from witnesses. In 2018, Isoro Aguirre is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Gabriel Fernandez pleaded guilty to first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial shed light on the failures of social workers who had been assigned to Gabriel's case. 4 social workers were charged with felony child abuse and falsifying public records, though the charges were later dismissed. The controversy surrounding their roles in Gabriel's death intensified calls for accountability within the system. Gabriel's story inspired a Netflix documentary, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, which brought global attention to the case. The documentary highlighted not only the abuse he suffered, but also the systemic failures that allowed it to continue. Advocacy groups and lawmakers responded to the tragedy by pushing for reforms in child welfare policies. Gabriel's case became a rallying cry for better training for social workers, stricter oversight, and more robust child protection laws. Despite the outrage and reforms, Gabriel's story remains a painful reminder of how vulnerable children can fall through the cracks of a broken system. His death has had a lasting impact, fostering awareness and a commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future. Gabriel's memory is preserved through foundations and initiatives aimed at protecting children from abuse. His story serves as a powerful call to action for communities, families, and institutions to prioritize the safety and well-being of every child.
Today, we're diving into a case. It's one that's been requested a lot, and it's definitely heavy, but incredibly important. It's the story of Gabriel Fernandez.
And what we really want to do in this deep dive is not just, look at the abuse itself, but really try to unravel all the systemic failures that led to this tragedy, to examine not just what happened, but also why it happened, and hopefully, explore what we can learn from it so that something like this doesn't happen again.
So Gabriel was an 8-year-old boy from Palmdale, California. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about this case, they wonder, how could so many warning signs be missed?
Yeah, it's a question that haunts a lot of people. And to really understand that, I think we need to go back to the beginning, kind of trace the events that led up to this horrific outcome.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's go back to the beginning. Tell me about Gabriel's early life.
So Gabriel was born in 2005, and unfortunately his early life was marked by a lot of instability. He was raised primarily by relatives, which kind of already suggests that there were some issues, some cracks in the family structure.
Right, and then there's his mother, Gabriel Fernandez.
Yeah.
And she had a history of struggles, drug abuse, some run-ins with the law. It's not to excuse anything, of course, but just to sort of paint a picture of her life leading up to this.
Yeah. We need to understand the full context, not just isolated events, but see the bigger picture.
Okay, so we've got this kind of backdrop, and then into the picture comes Isoro Aguirre, the boyfriend.
Yeah.
And at first glance, he seemed, kind, even attentive, which makes the contrast to what happened later even more horrifying.
Yeah, that contrast is really chilling because in 2012, Gabriel moved in with Pearl and Isoro. He's just an 8-year-old boy. He's entering what would become a living nightmare for him.
Yeah.
A nightmare. When we talk about abuse, people want to understand, what exactly happened? What did Gabriel endure? And I know it's hard to talk about, but I think it's important that we understand the extent of his suffering.
It is. And it's tough to recount, but we have to understand it to fully grasp, the magnitude of the systemic failures that happened here. So Gabriel was he was subjected to horrific beatings. He was starved. He was forced to eat cat litter. They locked him in a tiny cabinet. It was systematic torture disguised as discipline.
It's unimaginable, the terror that he must have felt. And you mentioned earlier that abuse isn't just physical, right? Like there's the emotional and psychological component as well.
Right, the psychological torment that Gabriel experienced, the constant degradation, the fear. I mean, that probably left even deeper scars, than the physical ones. And it's interesting because, from a psychological perspective, abusers often use this tactic called traumatic bonding.
Traumatic bonding. Yeah, so it's basically this cycle of abuse and affection. The abuser will, hurt the victim and then shower them with love and attention, and that makes the victim dependent on them, even though they're being abused.
It's like they're trapped. They're trapped in this cycle of love and fear.
It's very complex, and sadly, it happens a lot in these kinds of cases.
And, what makes this case even more unbearable is that there were so many missed opportunities to intervene.
Right.
Teachers, classmates, they noticed injuries, the signs of neglect, but want.
Right. Let's stop here for a second. We have multiple reports, right? Teachers, classmates, even neighbors saw signs. So why wasn't it enough? What were the barriers to effectively intervening? A lot of times these failures stem from systemic issues like lack of training, poor communication between agencies, overwhelmed caseworkers.
So it's not that individuals didn't care, it's that the system itself was not equipped to handle this.
Exactly. And it wasn't just school officials who were concerned. We had neighbors, relatives. They also tried to raise the alarm. Imagine being one of those people, seeing these signs but feeling powerless to stop it. That frustration, that helplessness, it really, really highlights how we need a more responsive system, one that doesn't just receive reports but acts on them decisively.
It's a terrifying thought, knowing that people were trying, but it still wasn't enough. And then on May 22nd, 2013, the unthinkable happened.
Gabriel was found unconscious in his home, and the injuries were so severe that doctors described them as some of the worst they'd ever seen. I mean, this wasn't just abuse, this was systematic torture.
2 days later, Gabriel passed away, and the nation was left grappling with this question. How could this happen? How could a child suffer so much for so long with so many people knowing that something was wrong?
That's a question that continues to haunt us, doesn't it? And it's a question that demands answers, not to place blame, but to understand where the system failed and how we can prevent this from happening again. So, we ended part one talking about that question. How could this happen? And, it's a question that demands answers, right? But it's also, I think, a question that fueled a lot of the change that came after.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that, California, where this all happened, saw some major changes in its child welfare system. What exactly happened?
Well, there was a lot of public outcry after Gabriel's death, right? People were outraged. They wanted to understand how this could have been prevented. And that kind of outrage really fueled a lot of legislative action.
Okay, so what kind of legislation are we talking about? What specifically changed?
One of the biggest things was the passage of Gabriel's Law. It's also known as AB 1432. And basically, this law was the result of all this public pressure to make sure another Gabriel Fernandez never happens again.
So what did Gabriel's Law actually do? How did it change things on the ground?
Well, think of it like, a safety net with multiple layers. That's what they were trying to create. So one of the main things it did was it really focused on improving communication, between all the different agencies that are involved in child protection, schools, law enforcement, social services.
So preventing those cases from, slipping through the cracks.
Right. Because before, information was often siloed, and that's part of what allowed Gabriel's abuse to continue for so long. Nobody was really talking to each other.
That makes sense. If one person misses something, there's a backup system in place to catch it.
Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't just about better communication. Gabriel's Law also mandated more comprehensive training for social workers.
Okay, because it's not just about having more social workers, right? It's about making sure they're equipped to handle these incredibly complex cases.
Mm-hmm. Right, giving them the tools they need to not just spot the signs of abuse, but also know what to do when they see it.
So what kind of training are we talking about?
Well, there was a big focus on recognizing and responding to the signs of abuse, understanding the different types of abuse. Like, it's not always physical. There's emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. And then there's cultural sensitivity training as well, and strategies for engaging with families who are in crisis.
So it's about, not just spotting those red flags, but also knowing how to actually interact with those families in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And beyond the training, the law also introduced stricter protocols for, investigating reports of abuse, like really emphasizing the need for thorough and timely action.
So they're trying to close all those loopholes that allowed, in Gabriel's case, allowed his abusers to keep doing what they were doing for so long.
Exactly. So, social workers are now required to do more frequent home visits, especially in those high-risk cases. And they have to document their findings really meticulously. Every detail matters.
So they're really trying to build a system where every red flag is taken seriously.
Exactly. Like a system where reports of abuse are met with immediate and decisive action. And a system where the child's safety is truly, truly the priority.
And you mentioned earlier that Gabriel's story kind of resonated far beyond California, right?
Yeah.
Did those changes, did they inspire similar reforms in other states?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Gabriel's case, it really sparked a national conversation about child welfare. And it kind of forced lawmakers and policymakers all over the country to kind of look at their own systems and ask themselves, could this happen here? And what are we doing to protect our kids?
Right. So other states saw what happened in California. I thought, okay, we need to take a look at our own systems.
Exactly. And a lot of states, inspired by the reforms in California, they started, implementing similar measures. They wanted to strengthen their own child protection protocols.
It's like a domino effect. Gabriel's case started this wave of change that spread across the nation. But I feel like it wasn't just about laws being passed, right?
Yeah.
There's been this shift in how we as a society think about child abuse, how we respond to it.
You're right. It went beyond legislative changes. I think Gabriel's story, it really helped break the silence that often surrounds child abuse.
Yeah.
It encouraged more people to, recognize the signs and to really understand how important it is to report it. And, that Netflix documentary, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, that played a huge role in that. You said you watched it.
Yeah, I did. It was it's tough to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough watch, but important.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it wasn't just the details of the abuse. It was seeing how the system failed him.
Yeah.
It made me wonder, could this happen in my own community?
Right. And that's the power of storytelling, isn't it? It makes us confront these uncomfortable realities and ask ourselves these hard questions. And that documentary, it brought this case to a global audience, and it forced people to see Gabriel as a real child, not just a statistic.
Yeah, it humanized the issue in a way that, headlines and court documents just can't.
Exactly. And that humanization, that emotional connection, that's often what, sparks real change. So while we can't bring Gabriel back, his story leaves behind this legacy, a legacy of awareness, of reform, and really this collective commitment to making sure that no child suffers the way he did. But we also have to acknowledge that no system is perfect. Right? There are always going to be challenges when you're trying to address an issue as complex as child abuse.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to make sure that this momentum for change continues? That Gabriel's story doesn't fade into the background?
That's a really crucial question, and it's a question that we'll explore further when we come back for the final part of our deep dives. Because ultimately, I think Gabriel's story is a call to action. It's a reminder that we can't afford to be silent. We have to speak up for those who can't, and we have to work together to create a world where every child is safe.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, the details of Gabriel's abuse, the systemic failures, but then also the hope, the reforms, the increased awareness. But it's not enough to just know about these things, right? What can we actually do? What can we do to make a difference?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, knowledge without action, it's meaningless, especially when we're talking about something as important as protecting children. But the good news is, there are things we can do, concrete steps that each of us can take to actually make a difference.
Okay, I'm ready to hear those steps. What can our listeners do starting, right now to turn their concern into action?
Well, first, something really simple but powerful. Educate yourself. Learn the signs of child abuse. And it's not always obvious. It can take many forms: physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, even sexual abuse. And there are tons of resources out there. You can go online, you can check out organizations like Child Help USA or the National Child Abuse Hotline.
I think a lot of people assume that they would know abuse if they saw it, but it can be a lot more subtle than we think.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, spotting the signs in children themselves. It's also about recognizing potential red flags, in the adults around them, in the families. Sometimes those are the only clues we get.
Okay, so we learn the signs, and then what? What if we suspect something? What do we do?
Don't hesitate. Report it. You don't have to be certain. Just concerned. It's always better to err on the side of caution. That phone call, it could literally save a child's life. And remember, reporting doesn't always have to be to, the authorities directly.
Right, you could talk to a teacher, a counselor, anyone who's in a position to help.
Exactly. And they can guide you and make sure that the child gets the support they need.
Okay, so that's kind of addressing those immediate concerns. But what about, preventing abuse from happening in the first place?
Yeah, that's crucial too. And one really important thing is supporting organizations that are dedicated to child abuse prevention. Groups like Prevent Child Abuse America, the National Children's Alliance. They offer all sorts of programs and resources, and they do a lot of advocacy work to really address the root causes of abuse.
I've heard of those organizations, but what kind of impact does, a donation actually make?
Even a small amount can go a long way, because these groups, they really rely on public support to, run those programs, train professionals, and advocate for stronger child protection policies.
So it's not just about money either. You can volunteer your time, you can spread awareness on social media, even just having conversations about this issue, about child abuse, helps.
All of that matters. And let's not forget the power of, advocating for change on a bigger scale. Contact your local representative. Support legislation that strengthens those child protection laws. Make your voice heard on behalf of those who can't speak up for themselves. Think about Gabriel's Law. Those sweeping reforms in California, those wouldn't have happened without public pressure, without advocacy.
It's a good reminder that our voices do matter. We can push for change. And sometimes it's as simple as, starting a conversation, breaking the silence that often surrounds this issue.
Exactly. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors. Create a culture where child abuse isn't a taboo topic, a culture where people feel safe speaking up, seeking help.
It's about creating a community where every child feels seen and heard and valued. I mean, in the end, that's what Gabriel deserved. That's what every child deserves.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a challenge. Don't let Gabriel's story be just another tragic headline. Let it be a call to action, a catalyst for change in your own life and in your community.
What will you do today? What will you do tomorrow, this week, to make a difference? How will you honor Gabriel's memory and help create a world where every child is safe from harm?
Remember, even the smallest actions can have a ripple effect. Speak up. Educate yourself, support those organizations, advocate for change, and most importantly, be kind. Because, in the face of darkness, it's our collective light that will illuminate the path to a brighter future for all children.
It's been a heavy journey, but an important one. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Gabriel Fernandez case. Let's all commit to being part of the solution, to making sure that no child has to endure what Gabriel did.